Somewhere above the Arctic Circle, frozen diaries still contain the last words of men who never returned. 3 expeditions went silent, and their bodies lay undiscovered for years before searchers stumbled on them by accident. The cold preserved their remains. It also preserved exactly what they were thinking when the end came. Here is the strange thing about dying in the far north. The cold that kills you also keeps you. It keeps the ink on the page, the film sealed in its tin, the last sentence trailing off in a notebook nobody would open for decades. So with these 3 expeditions, we are not guessing at the final hours. We can read them. That is what ties the cases together, and it is also what makes them impossible to shake. Salomon August André. Niels Ekholm was the meteorologist attached to the expedition, and before the balloon ever left the ground, he measured how fast it was leaking, and he did not like the answer. By his calculation, the Eagle, a 3-layer varnished silk balloon, was bleeding more than 100 kilograms of lift a day through the millions of tiny holes where the fabric was stitched together. André insisted the real figure was closer to 60. It hardly mattered who had the better number, because either one meant the same thing. The balloon could not stay up long enough to reach anything worth reaching. Ekholm worked that out and quietly resigned. Salomon August André, the engineer whose name was on the whole enterprise, launched anyway. On the 11th of July, 1897, André and 2 younger men, the physicist Niels Strindberg and the engineer Knut Frankel, lifted off from Danes Island in Svalbard and floated north toward the pole. The drag ropes that were supposed to let them steer tore loose almost immediately. After that, they were not flying. They were drifting. A little under 3 days later, the Eagle came down on the pack ice, hundreds of miles from any solid land, and the 3 of them climbed out into a place they were not dressed for. Wool coats and oilskins, no furs, sleds built rigid for a journey that did not involve crawling over ice ridges the height of a house. They started walking south. It took 83 days, and for much of it, the ice was drifting against them faster than they could march, so that a full day of hauling could leave them further from land than when they woke. Their diaries record the small miseries that actually kill people out there. Constant foot pain, diarrhea from half-cooked polar bear meat, exhaustion deep enough that they slept sitting up. On the 2nd of October, they reached a remote island called Kvitoya, and within a few days, all 3 were dead. One of André's last coherent entries is almost steady, almost calm. He wrote, "With such comrades, one should be able to manage under, I may say, any circumstances." Then nothing. For 33 years. It took an unusual thaw in the summer of 1930 to open the island enough for a Norwegian sealing ship to land there. 2 of its crew, looking for fresh water, instead found a boat half buried in snow, a boat hook engraved with the expedition's name, and 2 skeletons. André was propped semi-upright against a rock, as though someone had arranged him. Strindberg had been wedged carefully into a cleft in the cliff. His friends had buried him, by hand, with whatever strength they had left, and in a tin box near the bodies sat Strindberg's photographic film, frozen solid since the autumn they died. It still developed. Of 240 exposures, 93 came back, and I would argue there is nothing else quite like them in the history of exploration. They are photographs of 3 men hauling sleds across the ice, posing beside their wrecked balloon, cooking over a fire, taken by one of the men who would shortly lie down in the snow and not get up. They photographed their own ending, and they did not know that is what they were doing. What killed them is the part nobody can close. The bodies were cremated in 1930 before anyone thought to perform a proper autopsy, which means the evidence went up with them. Trichinosis from the bear meat, poisoning from too much bear liver, carbon monoxide from a stove inside a sealed tent, simple cold. A century later, researchers are still arguing the point with real conviction and no proof. The most honest verdict is that we do not know. André himself seemed to sense how the story would land. Near the end, in the notebook the ice would keep for 3 decades, he wrote a single question. Shall we be thought mad? He died not knowing whether anyone would ever read that question. The next man knew exactly who would read his last words, and he wrote them anyway. Robert Falcon, Scott, 11 miles. That was the distance between the tent where Robert Falcon Scott froze to death and the depot of food and fuel that would have kept him alive. 11 miles and a storm that would not break for 9 days. Scott had reached the South Pole on the 17th of January, 1912, with 4 companions, and the moment should have been the summit of his life. Instead, they arrived to find a black flag already flying. The Norwegian Roald Amundsen had beaten them to the pole by 34 days. Scott wrote it down plainly in his diary. Great God, this is an awful place. Then the 5 of them turned around and began the 800-mile walk home, beaten, underfed, and already dying. They went one at a time. Edgar Evans, the strongest man in the party, broke down first after a fall on the glacier and a head injury, and was gone by the middle of February. A month later, it was Lawrence Oates, whose frostbitten feet had slowed the group to a crawl. Oates understood exactly what he had become to the others. One morning, in the middle of a blizzard, he pulled open the tent flap and said the line that has outlived him by more than a century, "I am just going outside and maybe sometime." He walked into the storm. They never found his body, only later his sleeping bag. That left Scott, Edward Wilson, and Henry Bowers 11 miles short of the depot, pinned in their tent by weather that simply would not let up. Scott kept writing as the cold closed in. His last entry, dated the 29th of March, ends with a line meant for everyone they were leaving behind. For God's sake, look after our people. Then he wrote letters to Wilson's wife, to Bowers's mother, to his own wife, and the letters sat frozen in the tent for 8 months until anyone came. When the search party finally dug the tent out of the snow that November, one of them, Trygve Gran, described what they found in words he never recovered from. The frost had turned the skin yellow and transparent, and he had never seen anything worse in his life. Scott had thrown back the flap of his own sleeping bag and lay with one arm across Wilson's body, and beside the 3 of them sat 35 pounds of rock. They were geological specimens, fossils of an ancient plant, and the men had dragged them by hand, sled the entire way back, even as they were starving, even as they were dying. Those fossils turned out to be the first ever found in Antarctica, and they helped prove the frozen continent had once been warm and green and joined to the others. People still argue about whether Scott was a hero or a fool, and I think that argument misses the stranger, smaller facts sitting right there in the snow. 3 men who knew they were finished kept hauling 35 pounds of rock to the end, because the rock was evidence, and the evidence mattered to them more than their own weight on the traces. You can call that madness. I would call it about the most human thing in the whole story. The cruelest part is that none of it had to happen the way it did. The dog teams meant to meet them on the way back never came. The supply depot had been placed 35 miles short of its planned position after the ponies failed. The temperatures that March ran more than 20 degrees below normal on the coldest days. Every margin that should have saved them had quietly been spent before they ever started walking home. If you have made it this far, this channel exists for exactly these cases, the ones where the record outlived the people who left it. Subscribe, and I will keep bringing them, because the last expedition is the one with something the first 2 did not have, a man who could have stayed and chose not to. The Karluk. When the Karluk left British Columbia in June of 1913, it carried 25 people, including a scientist or 2, a crew of sailors, and an Inuit family with 2 small daughters. The ship itself was a converted whaler, 29 years old, with a hull never built for what was coming. By the middle of August, it was locked in the pack ice off the Alaskan coast, and the ice had begun to carry it slowly west, with everyone still aboard. In September, the expedition's leader, Vilhjálmur Stefansson, announced that he would take a small party out onto the ice to hunt caribou. He took 5 of the men and the best of the dogs and said he would be back in about 10 days. He never came back. Within hours of his leaving, the ice shifted and carried the Karluk away from him, and he made, by all accounts, no great effort to catch it. One of the survivors, the schoolteacher William McKinley, spent the rest of his life unable to forgive what came next, and his verdict on Stefansson was that the man never once seemed able to express any appropriate sorrow over the people he had lost. For the first 2 expeditions, the record that outlived everyone was written by the dead. For the Karluk, it would be written by a man who lived and who spent 60 years making sure the story could not be quietly buried. Command fell to the captain, Robert Bartlett, and Bartlett knew the ship was doomed. For 4 months, the Karluk drifted 500 miles, the ice grinding against the hull a little harder every week. Until on the 10th of January 1914, McKinley felt a severe shudder run through the whole ship. The ice had punched a gash 10 feet long below the waterline. The pumps lost the fight overnight. The next afternoon, as the Karluk went down through the ice, Bartlett put a record on the ship's gramophone and played Chopin's Funeral March, and stood and listened to it until the yardarm snapped and she was gone. That left 22 people on the open ice, and they did not stay together. One officer led 4 men off toward a different island and was never seen alive again. Their bodies turned up 10 years later with their supplies beside them untouched, which usually means the tent went down in a storm and the cold finished the rest in a single night. A second group of 4, led by the ship's doctor, split off on their own. They vanished completely. The only trace anyone ever found of them was a single sailor's scarf, frozen into a floe. Bartlett got the remaining 14 onto Wrangel Island, a march estimated at 40 miles that turned out to be 80 over broken ice. And the island did not save them either. 3 more died there. The geologist and a 20-year-old Norwegian ski champion both went down with kidney failure, later traced to spoiled rations that one of the suppliers had made deficient in fat. A third man was simply found dead one morning, and whether it was an accident, a suicide, or a murder, no one has ever been able to say. Then Bartlett did the thing that makes him the hero of the story. With a single Inuit hunter named Kataktovik, 7 dogs, and 48 days of food, he set out across the ice for Siberia to fetch help. They crossed 17 days of moving pack ice, the kind that can open into black water under your feet without warning. On the far side, Bartlett traded his own revolver for a fresh dog and pushed on by sled for 700 more miles, through temperatures of 50 degrees below zero and winds strong enough to flatten a man, until he reached a radio and could finally send word that the Karluk was gone and its people were dying on an island. Rescue did not actually reach Wrangel until the 7th of September 1914, 8 months after the ship sank. So, the obvious question: did Stefansson abandon his crew? The honest answer is that we cannot prove he did it on purpose. He always insisted he meant to return and simply could not reach the drifting ship. He went home, wrote a cheerful book called The Friendly Arctic, in which the whole thing came off as a success, and kept exploring for years. But I would say the verdict is written in who got remembered for what. The man who walked 700 miles to save them is remembered as a hero. The man who left on a hunting trip is mostly remembered for the book he wrote afterward about how friendly it all was. As for the 2 Inuit girls who were aboard the whole time, one of them lived a long life and died in 2008 at the age of 97, the last living person who had stood on the deck of the Karluk. 3 expeditions, 33 years, then 8 months, then 8 months again before anyone found the bodies. And in every case, what the searchers carried home was not only the dead, it was the record. Andrew's notebooks, Scott's letters to the widows, McKinley's memoir, written in cold fury 60 years after the fact. The far north killed these people slowly, and then it held on to every word they left behind while it was happening. That is the part I think about. We do not have to imagine how these men felt in their final days, the way we have to imagine it for almost everyone else who has ever died. They told us, and the cold made certain we could still read it. A balloonist wondering if history would call him mad. A captain asking the world to look after his people. A tin of film thawing out decades late into the faces of men who did not yet know they were already lost. If that is the kind of story you want more of, the ones where the record outlasts the people who wrote it, subscribe and stay with it. There are far more of them than you would think, and the ice is still holding most of them.